All right, it's time you get a little taste of code. And I know we've talked about no code for a long time now, but to be a way better no-code developer, you need to understand some coding structuring, formatting, and go a little bit more in depth than we have so far. And this will help you out tremendously when you're trying to understand how these APIs work, how the data is structured, what needs to get returned, what needs to get sent. Basically, the entire structure of an API call we need to know about. And we need to do that and show you that by using a little bit of code. So don't worry, we're not going to be learning JavaScript or C# or any of these programming languages you've probably heard of. We're simply just going to show you structure and format. So you can see on my screen here, and you're probably thinking like, wow, this is already too much for me. I don't want anything to do with this. But you don't really need to know what's going on here. I'm simply in a code editor. This allows me to just type out some JSON, which we're going to talk about in just a second, and present it in a better format so it's clear and you can understand it easier. Now, when we're interacting with all these APIs, the format is always JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Not really that important, but that's what it stands for. You can think of it as structured text. So when we've been working with these APIs, you've noticed that all the data that gets returned is in a structured format. You have all these curly brackets, all these parentheses, all this random stuff on a screen that is structured in a specific format. And up until this point, you probably didn't really understand what the structure is or what any of it means. You've just been able to utilize it, but actually understanding the data is going to help you develop so much faster, and it's going to make a lot more sense when you're interacting with these APIs. So let's hop over into this code editor. Now, I'm in Visual Studio Code. If you want to look into that, feel free, but we're just using it to, again, show the structure, and it's just a bit easier to understand here. But let's start with defining what a JSON object is and what is within a JSON object. In fact, there's 6 different types that we need to go over. Let's do that one by one. So the first is strings. Now, what are strings? Well, if you think about a string, all you have to visualize is something in quotations. It can literally be anything in quotations. So when we say string, we could say hello. We could also have a number inside of a string, and that would also be a string. We can have another random word, all lowercase, for instance, or we could have just random letters and numbers. As long as they're in quotations, this is going to be a string format. Now, next format we're going to have is numbers, and this will just be, well, numbers. They're not going to be in strings. So, for instance, up here we do have a number, but since it's in quotations, it acts as a string, and JSON is going to recognize it as a string. So moving on from a string, instead of that, we just have a 1. That would be a number. You could have negative 1.5. You could have 100. You could have negative 0.03. Anything that is a number is, well, going to be associated with a number. So we have strings. We have numbers. The next thing we can cover is Boolean. Now, Boolean is simple. I at first didn't know what Boolean was when I was learning code, but here we are. It's simply a true and false. So pretty easy. When you think Boolean, if somebody says Boolean, just know they're referring to a piece of data that is either going to return a true or false. So if you had a 1 + 1 = 2, and they had some Boolean there, that would be a true result. If it was 1 + 2 = 7, that would return a false Boolean value. So that's just something to think about when thinking about Booleans, true or false values or results. Next thing we can go over is null. Now, null is simply null. That just means there is no value associated with it. It's just null. There was no value. It didn't come up with a true or false. It's not a string. It's not a number. It's just nothing. Next, we have an array. So an array is anything within these brackets. So when you see those brackets, you automatically know it's going to be an array. Now, once we start getting into array and objects, you're going to start seeing strings, numbers, Booleans within inside that array or object. So for instance, we have an array. Say we have strings in there. So say we have a 1, and say we have a hello world. Now, that is an array of strings. So just think about that. you can't have something that is going to be string, string, and then number. That wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, and you can't do something like that. They have to be the same format when working with arrays. So just remember, you can't have numbers and strings together in the same array. You would have to make those a separate array. Now, if we get rid of that one, and you could just have something, even if you had our random numbers, that could act in your array as long as it is in a string format along with everything else. Now, if we get rid of that, because that looks a little bit messy, let's do another array, and this array, we can have numbers. So say you just have an array of 1, 2, 3. That is also an array, but you couldn't have 1, 2, 3, and then a string that said hello world, right? You have to have the same format, so we can get rid of that, and let's just have our number array. And again, you can have, this array can be huge. You could have thousands of pieces of strings or numbers inside this array, and they can get massive. So just keep that in mind. You can also have objects within arrays, but let's cover objects first. So let's say we have an object, and what does an object look like? Well, just think about key value pairs. You know, we've been working with these APIs, and every time we've been assigning a key and a value, and that is an object. Maybe you didn't know that, maybe you did, but now you can kind of see the point here. So say we have a key, which we're going to have in quotes. Then remember, you have that colon, and then we have a value. So that is a key value pair. Now, for another example, or a real world example, say we have animal, and then we have our semicolon, and then we have cat. Let's make sure we capitalize that. That is what an object is at its most basic level. And really, these are all of the types of formatting and items inside of a JSON object itself. You have strings, you have numbers, you have Boolean, you have null, you have array, and you have objects. Now, let's go over an example of what the entire JSON structure would look like and what we can do with all these different pieces. So I have another empty page here, and we're just going to lay out a simple JSON object that encompasses all those different types of data that we could have in it. So we start with our curly braces. Remember, when we're working in that API connector and bubble, you always have those curly braces in your JSON body. Super important to have these because that is what defines the JSON object itself. Now, say we have an object and we just have a bunch of information on a user. So I'm going to use myself in this example, and we'll just say I'm the user. So the first thing we could start off with is my name or who the user is. So for instance, we could have something like name. We have our colon, and then we have my name, Tucker. Now, what else could we have? Well, we could define my age. So we'll type in age, colons, and then you just have 27. Now, note that we do have these quotations around age. That's going to be the key, and they should always have quotations. But the value is a number. It's not a string, so we don't need quotations. We want to associate this as a number, so leave it without quotations. If you were to add quotations, then it would now identify as a string, and we don't want that. We want it as a number. But notice we still have this red squiggly line. That's telling us that something is wrong here. But one thing to remember with JSON, and you probably have seen this using the API connector again, is we always have to have a comma after our key value pair. And notice there is no error now. We just have my name, Tucker, and age 27. Now, this in it of itself is a JSON object. We could be done right here, but we want to go in a little bit more in depth here. So let's have another comma, and let's do something else. What else could we think about doing here? So we just have my name and age, and that's great. Now let's add an array. So what could we add as an array? Well, maybe we have hobbies. So let's do favorite hobbies. And then we can add our array. We'll add our colon and simply type in your brackets. So when you have your brackets, you can hit enter. Now we're inside an array. And what can we do inside of the array? Well, we could simply just list out some strings with my hobbies, or we could have an object within inside the array. So sure, I could have something like sports, travel, eating, and that could be an array. So we could just have favorite hobbies, sports, travel, eating. In fact, let's leave it like that. But I want to show you something else we could have done. Say we have favorite foods. Remember, I almost forgot that comma. Put the comma, and now we can write our quotes and say favorite food. We have that. Let's put our colon. And we want our array, again, of favorite foods. But let's associate a key value pair with inside this. Let's have an object inside of this. So in here, we could have an object. And then inside this object, we have our key value pair. So say we have a key value pair that just assigns a cuisine. So we have Italian with our quotes, Italian with our colon, and then we can assign the food. And say our favorite item is going to be garlic bread. So look at what we have here. We have an array that's called favorite food. Inside the array is now an object. So if you go to the very top level, we have a user object. Inside that, we have some information. Then we have an array of favorite hobbies and then our values. Then we have an array that has an object inside that array with its key value pair. So take a second to think about that. Maybe pause the video and just go over that in your head a few times. We have an object that has an array that has an object within that array. And if you go reverse, we have an object inside of an array. That array is inside of an object. So start to think about that. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Again, here you would add a comma. We would do Mexican. And then we would just add another food type. We could do tacos. And this is what we would call nesting. So when you have an array inside of an object or an object inside of an array, that just means that it's nested within another data type. So this object is nested inside this array. This array is nested inside of this object. So you can kind of see how the relationships are formed now. Now let's add another piece of data and we'll associate friends with me. And we're going to get a little bit deeper here. So let's add a comma, hit enter, and then we'll add a key value pair here, which is going to be a friend type. So we'll have quotations, we'll call it friends. Now inside friends, we want to have an array. So we'll have an array, but inside that array, we also need an object. So it's going to be an array of objects. So just simply type in the curly brackets. Now we're going to have an object and another object inside this array. So for instance, we'll have Brett's name. We have a colon, and then I want to have another object. So you can already see it getting deeper. Let's keep going. We have Brett, and we want to have another object. Inside here, we want more key value pairs. So we have friends. The first one's Brett. We want to assign a couple attributes. So we could say something like favorite color. We hit the colons, and we say red. Now, I have no idea what his favorite color is, but we're going to go with red for this example. We'll add a comma, and let's add another key value pair. So we could do something like, say, favorite city, and let's say we have Scottsdale. Great. Now we have an array of friends. Inside that array, we are going to have objects that contain our friend, and inside that friend, we're going to have another object that stores their attributes. So you can see just how nested it gets. So now we can copy and paste what we just made and duplicate it. Make sure you add a comma, hit enter, and add your next object. Now we can just simply change the values. Just like so. So now we have two friends, right? We have their attributes, we have the friends, their names, and they're all associated to me as the user. So we have access to all of this data inside this JSON object. If you really think about how nested it gets, we have an object inside of an object, inside of an array, and that array is inside of an object. But once you understand the basics, once you know what strings, numbers, booleans, object arrays all are, you start to identify and really understand any JSON structure. And understanding this will help you know exactly what to do when you're interacting with APIs and how to get access to each piece of data that you need in that JSON response. Remember, when you make an API call, it's always returning you a JSON object. Now that you know the structure, you're going to be much more equipped to handle it. But I don't want to end here. I want to tell you a little bit more about how to access this data in case you run into something like this. A lot of no-code and low-code tools actually force you to select specific types and pieces of data within the JSON object in order to display them. That requires you to know how to access, for instance, favorite hobbies inside of a JSON object. Well, when you're dealing with code, let's come back to our notes, and I want to show you how this could look. So right now we have a user object here. We would assign this and say, this is our user JSON right here, and this is what a user has within inside of it. So we have our name, age, favorite hobbies, our friends, their names, their attributes, etc. Now we have access to all this data. So we go back to our notes. How you would go about accessing this in code is the same you would in low code. So let's just do it really quick. We would have something like user. Say you wanted to get the favorite hobbies array right here and display sports, travel, and eating on your web application. How would you do that? Well, you would just go to user and then type in .favorites hobbies. So we have user, then we have favorite hobbies. And that would get you access to this array. So you would really be displaying user.favorite hobbies. And if you want to get really crazy and actually select a specific option within the array, you would just assign a number to it. Now, in code, numbers work a little bit differently. This isn't 1, 2, 3. No. This is 0, 1, 2. So just remember that when you're counting the numbers in an array, it starts with 0. So really, you think there's 3 here, and the number would be 3. It would actually be 2. So we have 0, 1, 2. And in code, that always yields true. It always starts with 0. So let's go back to our notes. So we have user, we have favorite hobbies. Say we want to get the first option. Well, in an array, how would we do that? We simply type in our array, these brackets, and then we hit 0. Now you would have user, you would get the favorite hobbies, and now inside that hobbies array, you would have the 0 value here, and that would grant you access to sports. So on a web page, if you wanted to display sports, you type in user.favorite hobbies, and then the array of 0, the 0th index. That is what that is known as. When you see this, just know that is the 0th index. This would be the 1 index, 2nd index, etc. So whatever you want access to, just go ahead and put that number in. Remember, it starts with 0. Now, next piece, let's do something else. Say we want to get something a little bit more tricky. Say we want to display Brett's favorite color. Okay, we have to go through a lot of nesting here to get to that. Well, we start at user. So we have user, and we have dot. Now, what's the next piece of data we have access to? Think about this like our bubble design. We have parent elements and child elements. So if we have name, we have age, we have access to all these right after user. So we could do user.name, user.age, user.favorite hobbies. Come all the way down here, we could do user.friends. Okay, so we have user.friends, and we have another dot. So user.friends dot what? Well, the next piece in line, or the next type of data points in line, are Brett and Brandon, the names of your friend. So we could do user.friends.brandon. Okay, so we have user.friends.brandon. What's the next thing we want access to? The next thing we're going to access is the favorite color. So it's simple. We just type in favorite color. So we have user.friends.brandon.favorite color. And that is how you access anything inside of a JSON object. Again, this will yield true both no code and code alike. This is how you display things inside of a JSON object. Simply go user, then just find that next piece of data in line to capture, do that, and just go down the family tree. So even if we had another array down here and it got nested further and further and further, it's simple. You just do dot, whatever's next, dot, whatever's next, and that's how you get access to data. If you run into the array, again, just have your array, and then you just put the index that you're trying to retrieve. Now, it can get a lot more complicated than this. We could be displaying only even numbers, only odd numbers, certain strings that start with certain letters, etc. But that's way beyond what we need to know how to do. Most likely, you're just going to run into something like this, where it says, hey, we want to access favorite color. Just provide us the path to do so, and we'll go ahead and display that for you. And that's how some no-code tools work. Others are nice, and you can just, like Bubble, for instance, you can just select that type of data in your workflows. Some other applications might have you do something like this, user.friends.brandon.favoritecolor, and then you can display that color. But I just want you to get familiar with JSON objects in general, because that's, again, all we're working with when it comes to APIs. It's every time going to be a JSON object, and it's always going to contain one of these data types. Once you understand each of these data types, well, you know everything there is to know about JSON. So I hope this was helpful. I know this was a lot going from zero code to just a little taste of it. But again, if you have questions, reach out in the community. I'd be glad to help you. And maybe watch this a couple times. Maybe go and research a little bit more on JSON, look at different examples. But don't worry, because we're going to be going a little bit more in depth when we get to our API structure examples and going through different API documentation. So stay tuned for that. Hope this wasn't too much to take on. I'll see you in the next one.